for a hearing on the posture of United States Cyber Command. We're pleased to welcome back Admiral Mike Rogers, the Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, Director of the National Security Agency, Chief of the Central Security Service, and several other titles, I believe. We are grateful for your many years of distinguished service and for your appearance before the committee today. Threats to the United States in cyberspace continue to grow in scope and severity, but our nation remains woefully unprepared to address these threats, which will be a defining feature of 21st century warfare. As a result, this committee has focused its attention on cybersecurity. We've expressed our concern at the lack of a strategy and policy for addressing our cyber threats. We were hopeful that after years without any serious effort to develop a cyber deterrence policy and strategy from the last administration, the new administration promised one within 90 days of the inauguration. But 90 days have come and gone, and no such policy and strategy have been provided. While inaction from the executive branch has been disheartening, this committee has not stood still. In fact, this committee has adopted more than 50 provisions over the past 4 years focused on organizing, empowering, and enabling the Department of Defense to deter and defend against threats in cyberspace. But cyber is an issue that requires an integrated, whole-of-government approach. We simply do not have that now. The very fact that each agency of government believes it is responsible for defending the homeland is emblematic of our dysfunction. We have developed seams that we know our adversaries will use against us, yet we fail to summon the will to address these seams through reform. Our allies, most notably the United Kingdom, have recognized the need for a unified approach. I look forward to hearing from Admiral Rogers his assessment of the recently established National Cybersecurity Center in the UK, and whether a unified model would help address some of our deficiencies here in the United States. The Coast Guard also presents an interesting model that should be evaluated for addressing some of our cyber deficiencies. The Coast Guard has an interesting mix of authorities that may be just as applicable in cyberspace as they are in territorial waters. They're both an agency within the Department of Homeland Security as well as a branch of the armed services. They can operate both within the United States and internationally and can seamlessly transition from law enforcement to military authorities. A cyber analog to the Coast Guard could be a powerful tool for addressing gaps that impede our existing organizational structure. It could also serve as a much-needed cyber first response team responsible for immediate triage and handoffs to the appropriate federal entity for further response, remediation, or law enforcement action. As for the efforts at the Department of Defense, I understand that Cyber Command is still on track to reaching full operational capability for the training of the Cyber Mission Force in the fall of 2018. But unless we see dramatic changes in future budgets, I'm concerned these forces will lack the tools required to protect, deter, and respond to malicious cyber behavior. In short, unless the services begin to prioritize and deliver the cyber weapons systems necessary to fight in cyberspace, we're headed down the path to a hollow cyber force. I also am concerned with the apparent lack of trained people ready to replace individuals at the conclusion of their first assignments on the Cyber Mission Force. Unfortunately, we have already heard about some puzzling issues. Specifically, out of the 127 Air Force cyber officers that completed their first tour on the Cyber Mission Force, none went back to a cyber-related job. That is unacceptable and suggests a troubling lack of focus. It should be obvious the development of a steady pipeline of new talent and the retention of the ones we've trained already is essential to the success of the Cyber Mission Force. Admiral Rogers, we look to you to help us better understand if we should take a closer look at if the existing manned, trained, and equipped models of the services are sufficient, or if we should consider a different model. Later this week, we plan to have another cyber hearing with outside experts, of which we plan to ask if we should be considering the creation of a cyber service. Admiral Rogers, welcome back. This is, I'm sure, one of numerous pleasures you've had of coming before this committee. Welcome. Senator Reid.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me join you in welcoming Admiral Rogers. And as you point out, Mr. Chairman, the frequency which the Admiral is called up to testify at the committee is a testament of not just his importance, but the importance of cyber and the severe challenges we face in this domain. So, again, thank you, Admiral, for your service and your dedication. We have faced serious and growing threats in cyberspace, from espionage, theft of intellectual property, and destructive attacks on the networks and systems that support our military and our economy, including critical infrastructure. Now we and our allies in Europe are experiencing firsthand that we are also vulnerable to the manipulation and distortion of information through cyberspace, which Russia is exploiting to threaten the bedrock of our democracy and our shared international institutions. The Armed Services Committee has for years emphasized the importance of developing the means and the strategy to deter cyber attacks. Now the scope of what we must defend against and deter is expanded, and the task takes on even greater urgency. In just a year's time, we will be in an election season once more, and the intelligence community has warned that Russia's election interference. While our decentralized election system has been designated as critical infrastructure, we lack an effective, integrated, and coordinated capability to detect and counter the kind of influence operation that Russia now routinely and continuously conducts. We do not yet have a strategy or capabilities to deter such actions through the demonstrated ability to conduct our own operations of this type. Secretary Carter commissioned a Defense Science Board task force on cyber deterrence. Prominent former officials, such as former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Dr. James Miller, served on this task force and have testified to this committee twice this year. They advocate rapidly developing the ability to conduct operations through cyberspace to threaten, quote, what key leaders on the other side value the most, which in the case of Russia could include their own financial well-being and status in order to deter influence operation and cyber attacks against us. Achieving a credible deterrent requires integration of capabilities and focused policy development across the Department of Defense, as well as through the whole of government, involving DoD, the State Department, the intelligence community, DHS, and the Justice Department. We have not seen evidence yet that the new administration appreciates these urgent problems and intends to address them. For Cyber Command specifically, the committee has heard concerns that our military cyber forces are almost exclusively focused on the technical aspects of cyberspace operations, such as detecting network intrusions, expelling intruders, and figuring out how to penetrate the networks of adversaries. The concern is that this focus misses the crucial cognitive element of information operations conducted through cyberspace, those actions designed to manipulate perceptions and influence decision-making. Admiral Rogers, these are critical issues, and there is much work to do, and I look forward to your testimony and your views on these urgent matters. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome back, Admiral.
Thank you, sir. Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reid, and members of the committee, thank you for your enduring support and the opportunity today to talk about the hardworking men and women of United States Cyber Command. I welcome the opportunity to describe how Cyber Command conducts efforts in the cyberspace domain and supports the nation's defense against sophisticated and powerful adversaries. The Department of Defense recognized 7 years ago that the nation needed a military command focused on cyberspace. U.S. Cyber Command and its subordinate elements have been given the responsibility to direct, operate, secure, and defend the Department's systems and networks, which are fundamental to the execution of all DoD missions. The Department and the nation also rely on Cyber Command to build ready cyber forces and to be prepared to employ them when significant cyber attacks against the nation's critical infrastructure require DoD support. The pace of international conflict and cyberspace threats has intensified over the last few years. Hardly a day has gone by during my tenure at Cyber Command that we have not seen at least one significant cybersecurity event occurring somewhere in the world. And this has consequences for our military and our nation at large. We face a growing variety of advanced threats from actors who are operating with ever more sophistication, speed, and precision. At U.S. Cyber Command, we track state and non-state adversaries as they continue to expand their capabilities to advance their interests in and through cyberspace and try to undermine the United States' national interests and those of our allies. Conflict in the cyber domain is not simply a continuation of kinetic operations by digital means. It's unfolding according to its own logic, which we are continuing to better understand. And we are using this understanding to enhance the department and the nation's situational awareness and management of risk. I want to update you on our initiatives and plans to address that issue of situational awareness and risk management. Our 3 lines of operations are to provide mission assurance for DoD operations and defend the Department of Defense information environment, to support Joint Force Commander objectives globally, and to deter or defeat strategic threats to U.S. interests and critical infrastructure. We conduct full-spectrum military cyberspace operations to enable actions in all domains, ensure the U.S. and allied freedom of action in cyberspace, and deny the same to any adversaries. Defense of DoD's information networks remains our top priority, of course, and that includes weapon systems, platforms, and data. We are completing the build-out of the Cyber Mission Force, as you heard the Chairman indicate, with all teams scheduled to be fully operational by the end of fiscal year 18. And with the help from the services, we are continually increasing the Cyber Mission Force's readiness to hold targets at risk. Your strong and continuing support is critical to the success of the Department in defending our national security interests, especially as we comply with the recent National Defense Authorization Act directive to elevate Cyber Command to Unified Combatant Command status. As you well know, I serve as both Commander of U.S. Cyber Command and Director of the National Security Agency. This dual-hat appointment underpins the close partnership between Cyber Command and NSA, a significant benefit in cyberspace operations. The institutional arrangement for providing that support, however, may evolve as Cyber Command grows to full proficiency in the future. The National Defense Authorization Act, in a separate provision, also described conditions for splitting the dual-hat arrangement, once that can happen without impairing either organization's effectiveness. This is another provision I have publicly stated that I support, pending the attainment of certain critical conditions. Cyber Command will also engage with this committee on several other matters relating to the enhancement of the command's responsibilities and authorities over the coming year. This would include increasing our cyber manpower, increasing the professionalization of the cyber workforce, building capacity, and developing and streamlining acquisition processes. These are critical enablers for cyberspace operations in a dynamically changing global environment. Most or all of these particulars have been directed in recent National Defense Authorization Acts, and along with the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy and the Joint Staff, we'll work with you and your staffs to iron out the implementation details. Cyber Command personnel are proud of the roles they play in our nation's cyber efforts and are motivated to accomplish their assigned missions overseen by the Congress and particularly this committee. They work to secure and defend DoD systems and networks, counter adversaries, and support national and joint warfighter objectives in and through cyberspace. The command's operational successes have validated concepts for creating cyber effects on the battlefield and beyond. Innovations are constantly emerging out of operational necessity, and the real-world experiences we are having in meeting the requirements of national decision makers and Joint Force commanders continue to mature our operational approaches and effectiveness over time. This, combined with agile policies, faster decision-making processes, increased capabilities, broader concepts of operations, and smarter command and control structures will ensure that Cyber Command attains its full potential to counter adversary cyber strategies. The men and women of Cyber Command thank you for your support and appreciate your continued support as we confront and overcome the challenges that lie ahead of us. We understand that a frank and comprehensive engagement with Congress not only facilitates the support that allows us to accomplish our mission, but it also ensures that our fellow citizens understand and endorse our efforts executed on their behalf. I've seen the growth in the command's size, budget, and missions. That investment of resources, time, and effort is paying off. And more importantly, it's helping to keep Americans safer, not only in cyberspace, but in other domains as well. I look forward to continuing the dialogue of the command and its progress with you in this hearing today and in the months to come. And I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you,
Admiral. We've seen another Russian attempt to affect the outcome of the election in France. Do you see any slackening, reduction in Russian/Chinese efforts to commit cyber attacks and even affect elections?
No, I do not.
Have you seen any reduction in Russian behavior?
No, I have not.
The Defense Science Board told this committee at least the next decade the offensive cyber capabilities of our most capable adversaries are likely to far exceed the United States' ability to defend key critical infrastructures. Do you agree with that assessment of the Defense Science Board?
I agree that the offensive side in general has the advantage over the defense. which is why the ideas of deterrence are so important here. How do we shape and change opponents' behavior?
In order to do that, we would have to have a policy followed by a strategy, right?
Yes, sir.
Do we have that now?
No, sir, but the new team is working on that. I want to make sure we all understand that.
And the check's in the mail? Do you agree we should, we've got the Federal Bureau of Investigation as the lead for law, Department of Homeland Security is the lead for critical infrastructure and defending government computer networks, and the Department of Defense is the lead for defending the homeland, defending military computer networks, and developing and employing. Is the status quo sustainable?
It's sustainable, but my question is it the most effective way?
Is it the most effective
to generate?
That's a better question. Thank you.
Yes, sir. In my recommendation, my input to this process has been our challenge is, so we built a foundation with a series of very specialized and distinct responsibilities. And yet I think what experience has taught us over the last few years is it's our ability to respond in a much more integrated, focused way is really the key to success here. And I think that's the challenge. How do we more formally integrate these capabilities across the government?
Do we need a cyber corps?
I'm not a proponent within the DOD. I am not a proponent of the idea of a separate cyber force or service, and that's for the following reason. In my experience, to be successful in cyber, you not only need to understand the technical aspects of this, but you need to understand the broader context in which cyber evolutions occur. Somewhere in the world, there's a man or woman sitting on a keyboard directing an operation. And so my concern is if we went with a very unique service approach to this, we would generate a force that was incredibly technically proficient, but not necessarily deep in understanding of the broader context. And I think using the service-based model is a stronger way to go about doing this.
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, 127 or whatever it is, the Air Force, not a single one stayed into cyber. Are you getting the kind of cooperation that you need to have trained people at work in your command?
So I've talked to all the service chiefs personally over the course of the last year on this topic. I have one service that I am particularly highlighting to them saying, look, we need to change the policies here. What I've suggested to the services is the cyber mission force, that part which I am responsible for, I acknowledge is only one part of the department's broader cyber needs.
Was that message received by the United States Air Force?
They're clearly still working their way through this. They have a broader, in defense of the Air Force,
I got it.
They have a broader set of challenges with respect to manpower writ large. I personally had the Chief of Staff of the Air Force come out to Fort Meade. I sat him down and said, here's what I am seeing. Do I have the right picture? Is this accurate? He has come back to me and said, no, Mike, you have an accurate sense that we are not where we need to be. And here's what I'm trying to do to get there. And so my job is to help him and also to keep the pressure on to make sure we sustain this.
In your job, you have to look at scenarios. Mm-hmm. Give us the best scenario and the worst scenario for cyber attacks on the United States.
The worst case scenario in my mind has a couple dimensions to it. Outright destructive activity focused on some aspects of critical infrastructure.
Including space.
It could be space. And then in addition to outright destruction, the other thing that concerns me, there's two other things. The second thing would be, in terms of worst consequence, do we see data manipulation on a massive scale? Most cyber activity data has been penetration and extraction.
Like changing voting rolls.
Yes. So what happens if we go in and we change data? That's a very different kind of challenge for us. And then thirdly, to me, the other element of a worst case scenario, what happens when non-state actors decide that cyber now is an attractive weapon that enables them to destroy the status quo? That's kind of the worst end, if you will.
And the best?
The best is
we develop a policy followed by a strategy.
We continue to make improvements both in capacity as well as the broader deterrence piece.
Thank you, Admiral. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you, Admiral. As you've pointed out, and I think we both pointed out, in terms of technical aspects of cyber, detecting intrusions, preventing intrusions, penetrating other networks, Cyber Command has been in the forefront. But this issue, which you allude to, of cognitive operations, information warfare, the changing public opinion, et cetera, have you been tasked to conduct such operations, to prepare to conduct such operations?
No, we have been not. That's not right now in our defined set of responsibilities per se.
Is it in anybody's set of responsibilities, to your knowledge?
There's some, I won't get into specifics in an unclassified form.
Yes.
There are some things we're doing right now, for example, in the fight against ISIS with combatant commanders in this regard. I don't want to go any deeper if I could.
That's fine.
But I think one of our challenges is if information is now truly going to become a weapon, almost like in many ways, how are we going to optimize ourselves to deal with this world? And we had much of this skill. If you go back to the Cold War, when I first started my journey in uniform, we had extensive infrastructure, extensive expertise. As the Soviet Union collapsed, we decided perhaps that expertise isn't required. We did away with many of the institutions. Many of the individuals who had the skill sets are no longer with us. I think we need to step back and reassess that.
So I would assume that if you've not been tasked to do that, that your expertise in cognitive warfare is rather limited in terms of those you just mentioned, the skill sets, the personnel.
Yes, sir. I'd be the first to admit it's not what our workforce is optimized for.
And certainly not comparable to what we're perceiving from other actors around the globe.
Certainly not on a day-to-day basis.
Within DOD, my knowledge suggests that SOCOM has been given the lead on information operations.
Broadly.
And is there any integration with Cyber Command?
Oh, we work SOCOM is one of those partners that I mentioned. So we do work very closely, General Thomas and I.
And I think the other issue, too, and it's come up in the context of all of our comments this morning, is that this is a mission that goes across several different organizations. And, in fact, we've heard comments about how the State Department in some areas has go back to the Cold War, they were doing the Voice of America.
Right.
They were doing all the radio towers that were beaming in. Mm-hmm. It's a new world, and they don't have either the expertise or the resources, et cetera, so no one seems to be doing this aggressively. Is that a fair estimate?
Certainly we're not where we need to be.
Right.
That's fair.
In terms of Russian operations, were you aware of the penetration of the election in 2016 in terms of active involvement of Russian entities directly or indirectly?
Yes, sir.
And what actions did you take? Just simply informing your superiors? Was that it?
So here's where I have to differentiate between my role as Commander of Cyber Command and the Director of the National Security Agency. As the Director of the National Security Agency, as I have publicly testified before other committees, when NSA first gained initial knowledge in the summer of 15 that the Russians were engaged in an effort to access political institutions, we informed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which has overall responsibility to inform those organizations. I don't, as the director of NSA, I don't deal directly with them. In turn, I then make sure that DOD and other elements within the government have that awareness. That's when my role as Cyber Command comes in. So as Cyber Command, I become aware of efforts in terms of intrusions and hacks directed against U.S. infrastructure. I turn to myself and make sure that the DOD system is optimized to withstand, because they were coming after DOD at the same time. In addition, we coordinate with the Department of Homeland Security. Is there a requirement are you looking for DOD? For example, if we had defined voting infrastructure as critical infrastructure, then under the set of duties assigned to Cyber Command, had the President or the Secretary of Defense determined that DOD needed to insert themselves in this, I would have been tasked to do that as Cyber Command.
And so if you had been tasked, you would have been prepared technically to try to disrupt these operations?
Yes.
And then again, given, I'm sure we've all been looking back and the after-action reports are still being written about 2016, in your estimate, we have to be much, much better prepared for 2018 and beyond. Is that fair?
I apologize, Senator.
After looking at the experience in 2016, as you just described, knowledge of penetration, attribution to a foreign state, going after key systems in this country, some of which have now been designated as critical infrastructure, we have to be much, much better prepared for 18, 20, and beyond.
I agree. I apologize. I didn't.
No, that's fine, sir. Thank you very much.
Admiral Rogers, it'd be unfair for me to ask you to evaluate the article I showed you only this morning because you hadn't read it yet. But the title pretty much says it. It says that it appeared this morning, "Are cyber crooks funding North Korea's nukes? How does Kim Jong-un come up with the billions to pay for nuclear tests? Increasingly successful online bank heists provide a lot of the funding." Does that make sense to you?
So I'm not going to get into specifics in an unclassified form, but we have publicly acknowledged, we have seen the North Koreans use cyber in a criminal mechanism, if you will, to generate monetary resources.
It has to come from somewhere.
Sir.
And when you look at it, you kind of eliminate, you come down to that conclusion that they might be right on this.
Although I would highlight this is only one element of the North Korean broader attempt to generate revenue and get it back to North Korea.
Yeah, well, when we look at and see the growth in this thing from 2006 to 2015, the number of cyber attacks has climbed by 1,300%. And then you talk about, and we've all visited about the policy or the lack of policy and making the decision. There's some thought that maybe there's too much authority at the top. It was General Goldfein that was quoted in December of last year, actually before this committee, said, "If we want to be more agile, then the reality is that we are going to have to push decision authority down to some lower levels in certain areas." Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. And we've highlighted in the cyber arena to Secretary Mattis as he has assumed his new responsibilities. I think this is an important area that we need to reassess, particularly within the cyber arena.
Yeah. Just a matter of a few weeks ago, we happened to be in Israel, and we met and talked to their National Cyber Directorate, Dr. Evitar Montanya, for a cyber subcommittee meeting. He actually came over, and we had it was Senator Rounds who was with me at that time, and of course he chairs the subcommittee, and we had a meeting that I think was pretty productive. That Dr. Montano is very careful not to say that perhaps there might be doing something better there than we're doing. He said it's much more complex in the United States because of the size and all of that. But he also pointed out three things that were significant. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts, or if you studied their system, and maybe some other countries too, to see what they're doing.
With the case of Dr. Montanya, there's a reason why every time I'm in Tel Aviv, I see him, and every time he's in the United States, he sees us.
I knew that's the case. He said the same thing.
From each other, and in fact, we are talking about some potential test cases that we could use with a new team in place, so we'll see how that plays out over time. But I look to him. One of the things that I have learned in my journey in cyber is there is no one single organization, group, or entity that has all the answers. So it's about the power of partnerships here, and how do you create a system that enables you to gain insight and knowledge from a whole host of partners, some within the United States, outside the United States, within the government, the academic world, industry. He's one example of the power of that to me.
Yeah, I kind of got that impression too. When General Alexander was in that position, he spent some time out at the University of Tulsa, and I know there are many other schools too. The chairman asked the question, are we having access to the people that are going to become necessary to staff this new, very serious problem that we have? Is there an effort going back to some of these schools and to promote the programs as were promoted in that particular university?
Oh, there is. Between NSA and Cyber Command, we have relationships right now with over 200 academic institutions around the United States, because that's in part the future workforce for us. Although one thing I try to highlight is be leery of creating a cyber force where everyone is cookie cutters. We need to get a broad range of skills and experience here. And some people are going to be really good at this, and they won't necessarily have advanced education, but they've spent much of their personal life in this. So we've got to build a construct where we can get that full spectrum of capability.
And you know, we look and we see what some of these countries are doing. Putin, when he came in after their parliamentary election, and they didn't have any communists for the first time in 96 years, he started doing things in addition to just the coming in and declaring a level of warfare. He also started working, and apparently, according to Poroshenko, they have used cyber capabilities to attack the Ukrainian government more than 6,500 times over the last 2 months. So this is something that is happening, not just, it's happening all over the world.
Sure.
And you see something like the example in Ukraine that didn't take any lead time, and all of a sudden they're already inflicting that type of harm, and I'm sure that you're right on top of everything that's happening.
We're trying.
With us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Admiral, for your public service. In response to Senator Reid, you said that you were aware of Russian attempts to interfere in our election. Were you aware of Russian communications with members of the Trump campaign team?
I'm not, now you're into my role as NSA, I'm here as Cyber Command. I'm not going to publicly get into that, sir.
I thought, I understand your reluctance, but I also see you not just Cyber Command, I see you as
Yes,
NSA Director. Okay. The chairman mentioned and asked you, is this what we see, this behavior, is this a new normal? To which you responded, I think somewhat regretfully, yes.
Yes, sir.
How should we counter these kind of cyber-enabled information operations, and who has the responsibility for these kind of operations?
In terms of Russian execution of the operations or our response? I apologize, I'm trying to understand. Both. Well, in the case of the Russians, again, if you refer to the publicly available intelligence community assessment, we identified multiple Russian security elements that were involved in this campaign. With respect to what should we do, the first is I think we need to publicly out this behavior. We need to have a public discourse on this. Those nation states, groups, or individuals that would engage in this behavior, they need to know that we're willing to publicly identify them and publicly identify the behavior. Secondly, I think we've got to make this much more difficult for them to succeed. That means hardening our systems, taking a look at our election process, which is not, Cyber Command's role, but I think broadly we need to look at this end to end and ask ourselves, what changes do we need to make in this structure? Thirdly, I think as a society, as a nation, we need to acclimatize ourselves to the idea that we're in many ways back into a time frame of disinformation, false news, goes to Senator Reid's point, manipulation of media. You got to be a much more discerning reader, so to speak, in many ways in the world that we're living in right now. And then lastly, I think we also need to make it very clear to those nation states or groups that would engage in this behavior, it is unacceptable and there is a price to pay for doing this.
So at this point, it sounds, listening to the answers to the previous questions, that we are really in a position that we can't prevent a cyber attack on things like our critical infrastructure.
Again, when we say prevent, it's one of the reasons why deterrence becomes so important. The goal should be we want to convince actors you don't want to do this, regardless of whether you could be successful or not. It's not in your best interest, and you don't want to engage in this behavior.
In a different setting that is secure, would you share with us where we have either under the threat of an attack or an attack deterred the word you just used, deterrence?
Yes, sir. I could share with you in a classified setting where we've either driven them out of a network or...
Okay, that would be very helpful. Now, would you consider it critical infrastructure voter registration rolls?
I think that one of the challenges, if you go back to the the process we use to identify the current 16 defined critical infrastructure areas in the private sector, we tended to look at that from a very industrial, is there an output associated with it? One of the things I think that we need to be thinking about now is not that an output isn't important, because you could argue an election generates an output, but does data and information exist in areas that's of critical consequence to us as a nation? We really didn't look at it that way in simplistic terms, and I think we need to. We need to reassess it.
We sure better, because if someone shows up to vote and suddenly they find out they're not a registered voter,
Sure.
because indeed it's been attacked and the data has been manipulated and taken them off the rolls, that's pretty serious.
Yes, sir.
And that's critical infrastructure.
Yes, sir. We need to take a look at that definition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me follow up on the chairman's statement with regard to the Air Force cyber officers not remaining in that field of work. Would one of the reasons be because they do not view it as a good career path?
No, if I could say, when we say not in that field, the experience we're seeing is they're taking officers that are rolling out of the cyber mission force, that structure that I'm responsible for, and employing them in other areas in cyber in the department. That's why I say part of the challenge, if you're a service, you have a wide spectrum of cyber requirements beyond just what Cyber Command is responsible for. It's why I'm trying to make the argument with the services. What we need to do is, and I've talked to them and said, look, I think, something on the order of a third should stay with us. The rest, we should then look, how do we put them elsewhere within this broader cyber enterprise to build the cyber level of expertise across the department? I don't want to make it sound like what the Air Force is doing is just ripping people once they finish their 3 years with us, so to speak, and then making them airplane mechanics, for example. That's not what we're seeing at all.
Okay, for the third you'd like to keep, you think that's a good way to get to be a 4-star?
Do you mean, could you build a career over
Right.
time? Well, clearly in the military we're moving into, I'm not the last person who's going to be doing this as a 4-star, I don't think.
Okay, and then with regard to the cyber service, which you are doubtful about, do I understand Britain does have such a cyber?
No, their
Or-
structure is less a cyber service and more a combination of active as well as significant.
Anybody trying this, or any of our allies trying this?
There's nobody right now who's really gone to a single cyber service. Most are trying to take, within the existing service structure, can you create a dedicated work specialty, so to speak, where that's what you do for your career? That's what's being done by most nations around the world.
Posted on that. Now, on page 2 of your written testimony, you say advanced states can continue to maintain the initiative just short of war, challenging our ability to react and respond, unquote. So what constitutes an act of war in your opinion, or in terms of the policy of the agency?
So first, I'm not a
Command.
lawyer and I'm not a policy individual, and that question at its heart is about legality and policy. It is clear that we do not, and not just the United States, I would argue broadly internationally, we haven't yet reached a broad consensus on how you would define in clear, actionable terms what an act of war within the cyber arena looks like. And to date,
How are we going to do that?
we're going to get our policy people together. And we're trying to discuss this broadly. I know, again, it's outside my lane, but I know we're involved in broad discussions both internally within the U.S. government as well as with foreign partners about how we develop a broader consensus on that.
But will help us out, though, because it may not be in your lane. You're not a lawyer, you say, but you would certainly be one of the first people I would ask in terms of what sort of act, in your judgment, would go beyond this this threshold of war.
Right. So what I looked, personally for me, what I look to do is, could we define a set of criteria as intent, impact, the tactics or techniques that were used, for example? Could we develop a set of very specific criteria that would help us define this rather than this broad, nebulous is the wrong word because it implies people aren't really focused on it, but this rather general kind of conversation we often tend to find ourselves in. I'm trying to mentally work myself through how could we get this down to a more specific set of attributes that would then help us. I see those attributes, that therefore would be defined as an act of war, as an example.
And one other thing, you say technical developments are outpacing laws and policies. We certainly find that in the commerce area also.
Sir.
But do you need anything new in this next NDAA that you don't have now?
I don't know, specific to the NDA, in broad terms, my input to the process has been we need to reassess authorities and delegation. We need to take a look at, do we have the right investments in manpower? Are we investing in the right capabilities? I'm very honored that the department is focused on this mission. There shouldn't be any doubt in anybody's mind. There is focus on this mission set. And I'm the first to acknowledge cyber competes with a broader range of priorities and needs. But the argument I'm trying to make is within those priorities, I think cyber is pretty high, and we need to focus the investment and prioritize it. And we can't be willing to accept 5 to 10 years for development cycles, whether it's getting the right people, whether it's training them. That's just not going to get us where we need to be.
To the extent that laws and policies are being outpaced, tell us what you need. Let us know what you need.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following the line of questioning by Senators Nelson and Reid, one of the issues raised by Russian intervention in our election is how our government as a whole responds to cyber attacks and how it escalates its response. Do you believe that there is a coherent plan in place to allow the federal government, in coordination with state and local governments, to respond to major cyber attacks on the country and to escalate the response as appropriate?
To be honest, Senator, I don't know enough to accurately answer the question because some parts of that strategy would be outside my purview, and I'm just not smart about all the sub-elements. I'm not trying to be a smart ass, but part of this is just outside my knowledge. So I'm just not positioned to say categorically yes or no.
So I was concerned by your earlier responses that your strategy is deterrence, because I don't see how deterrence is going to work with regard to Russia, since we've seen a continuation of an interest on their part to hack our systems and hack other countries' systems and their elections. So I guess what I'm looking for from you is leadership in coordination with other government agencies throughout the U.S. government to be prepared for our next election.
No, don't get me wrong, I'm part of this. If I could, I don't think you heard me say that I thought our strategy was deterrence. What I thought, at least I communicated, was deterrence should be a part of a broader strategy. It shouldn't be the only thing. I'm the first to acknowledge that.
Do you think there's, particularly the transition between private companies and a government response, are there the authorities in place to accomplish these transitions effectively? And if not, what kind of authorities might you need?
I don't know if there's certainly an authorities aspect to it, but part of this I'm wondering is a cultural. So the government comes to a private entity, and you saw this in the Russian hack scenario, and the government informs this private entity, the Russians have penetrated your system, here's where they are. In some cases, the responses are, hey, want to work with you. That's great. Thanks. Can we come back? In some cases, it's thanks very much, and we never hear anything. In some cases, it's I don't believe you. In some cases, it's that's not the role of the federal government. You saw this play out in, for example, some states' response to the election.
Correct.
And that's what some states came back and said, hey, look, that's not your guys' role.
And that's the testimony we've heard in a few hearings now.
Yeah.
So I'm highly concerned that if you don't have the authority, or some aspect of the federal government doesn't have authority to say to a Secretary of State, we recognize it is a state's right to run elections. We recognize that you choose the technology that you want to pursue. We recognize it's a state's rights issue. But if you don't have a level of sophistication that has been certified as cyber protected, it's not adequate. So what I really hope you can come to this committee with is a list of authorities you might need to put in place before the next election, because it's not adequate to defer this to any Secretary of State in any given state that they think they're covered. we need assurances that they are covered by the most highly sophisticated cyber experts in our government. And I think a lot of that cyber expertise is being developed by the Department of Defense.
Yes,
So I
ma'am.
think your leadership and coordination is so necessary.
Yes, ma'am. So please, I don't dispute that at all. Much of what you're asking me, though, really falls in the Department of Homeland Security, and I don't want to speak for DHS because Senator Kelly should, Secretary Kelly should be able to speak for himself. I do acknowledge, particularly if we were to define this as critical infrastructure, then clearly DOD has a role here.
Agreed.
I mean, there's no doubt about that. Yes, ma'am.